Welcome back, fans, to another episode of the Canadian Baseball Network podcast. We're going to give you a little bit of a break from the Toronto Blue Jays here midway through the season and actually go back in time to discuss Canada's other team, the Montreal Expos.
Yeah, and on this podcast, Matt, we haven't talked much about the Expos, right? So, their history, some of the fantastic players that went through there, um, a huge part of Canadian baseball history, right? And getting a chance to talk today to someone who sure knows a lot about them.
Yeah, so Danny Gallagher is our guest today. He covered the Expos for various outlets and has written 10 books. And his most recent one, titled Explosion, we're going to dive into that and his history with the Expos. Some younger fans, Jackson, may not even remember the Expos. So it's been 20 years since they made the move to Washington. So it's going to be a great conversation. I don't know if I've come across anyone that knows the Montreal Expos better than our next guest, Danny Gallagher. Danny, how's it going?
Yeah, very good. Thanks so much, Matt, for having me on the podcast. It's kind of a privilege and an honor, considering that, Bob Elliott is the guy kind of running the show at the Canadian Baseball Network, and Kevin Glue doing a super job as well, and Matt, and you guys, Jackson, and I pitch in once in a while, with a story. But it's quite a network of great stuff going on.
Yeah, and we appreciate all your contributions, and especially when it comes to the Montreal Expo. So the first thing I want to talk about is your new book, Explosion is the name of it. Tell us a little bit about this book and where the inspiration came from. This was your 10th book on the Expos, was it not?
That's right. And for 5 years in a row, I've written a book about the Expos, and also 7 years in a row, I've written a book, but one of them has not been about the Expos. It's one was about the history of Swiss Chalet and Harvey's. So the first one that started all this streak was the Blue Monday one in 2018. So every year since then, I produce a book of some sort, but I won't have a book in 2025, but one in 2026. So, Explosion is a continuation of my previous four books in this, the streak of 5 consecutive Expos books. It's a collection of vignettes, short and long, about players and executives and special games from 1969 to 2004. So what I'm doing is trying to get a hold of different players from different eras that haven't been written before, and I put them into this new book.
Well, that's interesting because, the Expos 20 years since the Expo this year, since the Expos moved to Washington. What is the process like to track down former players? And when you say you covered the team for a long time, when you say I'm writing a book on the Expos, what's kind of their reaction?
Well, some of them are excited. Some of them, I can't get a hold of them. Some of them, they don't return messages. But for the most part, a lot of them cooperate. It takes some tracking down. It doesn't happen right away when I make a phone call or an email. I need a certain amount of follow-ups to finally get an interview, but it's all worth it. Some of these stories, you know, they they've never been written up for quite a while. Some of these guys, like, let's say Brian Snyder caught the last year of the Expos, and it starts off with Gene Mock, who's deceased. He was the first manager of the Expos, and I was able to talk to his daughter, who is his only daughter, Leanne Simons, and get a different perspective from her about her father, who was the manager for 7 years at the Expos, and he was a strict disciplinarian. And his daughter said that if he wasn't married, or his first wife said if he wasn't married, he'd probably live at the ballpark because he loved the ballpark so much. And it's a reporter years ago asked Gene Mock, probably trying to do a feature story on Gene Mock, asked him, "Is there anything you like to read? Do you have any hobbies?" And Gene Mock said, "I love the box score."
So would Gene
I love
Mock
reading
read
the
this
box
book
score.
if you were alive? That's my question.
Yeah, so it's it's really interesting. All of the I started with the chapters on some of the older players from the early days of the Expos, like Dick Raditz and Floyd Wicker and Larry Jaster and Dan McGinn and Joe Sparmer and John Stollmeyer and Ron Woods. And then I worked my way. It's kind of like done in a chronological order of the franchise, these stories. So that's how I kind of do it.
Yeah, so I was not to give away my age here, but I was 12 years old when the Expos moved to Washington, and I vividly remember my parents would take me to games that when they came to Toronto every summer. If they were in Toronto, we were going to those games. I remember having a Blue Jays and Expos T-shirt. I don't know where it is now, but so tell us a little bit about what in your career covering the team, writing these books. What are some of the things that you might have learned that the average fan might not remember about the Expos?
You're talking about my days on the beat, or
Yeah, both, or through conversations for these books.
yeah, I think when you're on the beat, you find out a lot of things that the public wouldn't know, and then of course you put it into a story in the newspaper. My first newspaper on the beat with the Expos was the Montreal Daily News, and then there was the Ottawa Sun, and then I all worked for Associated Press and so on. But I've always been a kind of like an investigative reporter from when I was a young reporter, and then with the Expos, you're trying to beat the opposition to different types of stories. And I remember Dennis Martinez in 1989. I was sitting with him in the Expos dugout, just me and him shooting the breeze. And he proceeds to tell me that he just signed a 2-year contract extension with the Expos. So that was a scoop for me the next day that nobody else had. Yeah, that was in the days of no internet and no Twitter or Facebook. So and you hope that nobody has a story when the paper comes out the next day. So
Yeah,
it's just developing a rapport and relationships with different players when you're on the beat, or even after the team is gone. You continue to know some of these guys, and if you want to write a story for a book, it's easier to get them to talk to you.
yeah, for sure. Yeah, we've talked to a couple of different beat reporters, and they talk about, building those relationships all the time. I want to touch a little bit on a couple of years that were big in Expos history, both kind of not great years, I guess you could say, for the Expos. 1994, that was kind of the team people thought they were going to make a run. Take us back to that time and take us through how good that team was, first of all, and what it was like when that strike hit.
Yeah. You know what? It started when Felipe Alou took over as manager in 1992. They started getting better and better. And 1993, they had a tremendous year too, almost as good as the one in 94. So they really built up quite a connection with themselves on the team, that they were really a powerful team, and it carried into 1994, and they were 74-40 when the darn strike came along, and later the cancellation of the season. But they were a tremendous ball team, great offense, great defense, great starting pitching, and they had a great bullpen, with John Wetland and Mel Rojas and Jeff Shaw and Tim Scott, and the starting pitching of Jeff Vasil, Pedro, and Kenny Hill, and the main catcher was Darren Fletcher. But they had really a great, talented team. It was so unfortunate that it ended.
What was the feel like in the city during that time? Because that was, they were going on quite a run there, and maybe the feel leading up to the strike, and then when the strike hit, what was the reaction of fans and the fan base and the city as a whole?
Yeah, see, that year and a lot of years, the Expos drew on a walk-up crowd. If they were starting to get really good in 94, they started to get better attendance. And a lot of the crowds that year in 94 were walk-up crowds that, people just walking in off the street and buying tickets, as opposed to season ticket holders. And that particular year they had, and it wasn't that great a total of season tickets, about 8,500 season tickets sold for 1994. And, Claude Brochu, the managing general partner, obviously hoping that there would have been a lot more season tickets sold and better attendance. And as I said before, they were drawing on that great team for 93. They just got better. And every time they hit the field, they thought they could win every game because they had so much talent. Even if they were behind, they knew that they had the talent to come back and win the game. They were so confident and so lots of braggadocio. They were just a really good team.
So, getting back to the book, were there any stories? And I don't want you to give away too many of your secrets because I want people to buy the book and read it for themselves. But were there any stories that you hadn't heard before about that season, or anything that really stuck out to you?
I would say that the just prior to the start of the season, I actually wrote it in the Globe and Mail on April the 1st of 1994, saying Claude Brochu telling me that our financial situation is very, very poor. And if this is the year that we have to win because we have a low payroll, we have guys a lot of players not really necessarily making too much money. This is the year that we got to win. So I think they were nicely surprised that Ken Hill came along in 1994 and won 16 games and should have won 20 if there was no strike. And then they acquired him in a trade after the 93 season for Delino de Shields, and they turned Pedro, the reliever, into a starting pitcher, and he was like really dynamite. So there was a lot of good things going on there, and they had a great coaching staff. Moises Alou and Grissom and Larry Walker in the outfield, and it ran on all cylinders. It was just really special.
The summer months are fast approaching, and the place to be this summer for young baseball players is the Baseball Zone's summer camps. This July and August, the Baseball Zone is offering indoor and outdoor camps. It's a fantastic way for young athletes to improve their skills, make new friends, and of course have plenty of fun. They're also offering a summer membership this year that's unlimited summer camp access for $9.99. For more info and to sign up, head to thebaseballzone.ca.
Yeah, I think some of my favorite baseball jerseys this year are Pedro's Expo jersey and a Larry Walker Expos jersey. Obviously, the second one for Canadian purposes. But it's funny you speak of the payroll and the financial situation of the team, because I do want to talk about 2004 and the eventual move to Washington. But was the financial situation always kind of an issue with this franchise, and why was that?
I think because they blame it, I guess, on the fan support, that there wasn't enough fans coming to the game. Like, it all kind of happened after the 1984 season. This is my thinking. After Gary Carter was traded after the 84 season, Charles Rompin told the general manager, Murray Cook, that, Murray, I want you to trade Gary Carter. And the story was that he was making too much money, like, $2 million a year or something. And that's when Charles was kind of putting his foot down and saying, I don't want to pay Gary Carter all this money anymore. So they traded him to the Mets. They got some good guys in return. But I think that after that, the fan support started to fall, because they had that great run from 79 to 83. When that was the talk of Montreal, was that great dynasty, almost a dynasty, even though they just made it to playoffs the one year in 81. They had great crowds, they had great teams. 82, 83, they should have done better, but they didn't. And then 84, that's when Charles said, I have to do something about, cutting costs. People didn't like his way of thinking, but and then, from there on, I think the fan support fell down. And in 1989, when the Expos should have won that year that they led the National League East for most of the year, and they fell apart in August and September, and they finished at 81 and 81. That was it for Charles Baumel. He put the team up for sale. But he's told me several times over the years that fan attendance disappointed him for the most part at Expos games. And the only time that they really drew pretty good was that period from 79 to 83. And and then, they drew half decent in 93, 94. And then after that strike, then that really kind of turned the attendance down.
Yeah, it seems like that strike kind of killed baseball for a lot of people, at least for a few years. So let's get to 2004. I want to ask the same question about, speaking to people and whatnot for the book and some of the stories in the book. But before we do, when did you first start hearing rumblings about the end in Montreal?
I think it when November the 6th, 2001, when the owners voted 28-2 to contract or eliminate the Expos and the Minnesota Twins. Bud Selig said at the time that these two markets are not putting out enough fans to make it worthwhile to have those teams in existence. And boy, did that ever hit the Expos executives and the fans and so on. And then, but nothing really per se happened as far as contraction. But within 3 months, Jeffrey Loria, the majority owner of the Expos, sold the Expos to Major League Baseball. And in return, he was allowed to buy the Miami Marlins. And then John Henry, the owner of the Marlins, bought the Boston Red Sox. So that was kind of like another beginning of the end for the Expos those last 3 years. And what they were saying almost at the end of the 2002, 2003 season, that they're almost ready to leave somewhere, but they stayed in town. And they were there for 2004. And then, but that was kind of like the beginning of the end when Major League Baseball took over the team. Major League Baseball, Selig and those guys, say that they tried to sell the team to somebody in Montreal to keep the team in Montreal, but nobody seemed to come forth and want to keep the team.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's some really good recent baseball history. Loria, John Henry. I actually didn't know that about the Minnesota Twins were a part of that conversation either. So that's really interesting. Looking back, you obviously talked to players about that season, both at the time and now. What were the perceptions of the players? I'll say at the time, when that news was all kind of coming down.
Well, they were the Expos in 2003 and 2004. You remember, they had to spend part of both of those seasons playing about 22 home games in Puerto Rico. So that was the Expos or the Major League Baseball's plan to try to sell the Expos to other parts of the world outside North America and try to. I guess they thought that Puerto Rico might be a possible market to relocate the Expos. But in that period of time, they also talked to Monterrey, Mexico, and Washington, and Portland, Oregon, and Charlotte, North Carolina. So Charlotte apparently was really close to taking the team, and the same with Portland, but they felt that Washington had the best chance to really survive for a number of years, and that's where they ended up sending the Expos. But what was funny, up until September the 28th, which was the day before the official announcement was made that they were moving to Washington, it was almost a slam dunk that they were going to play in Montreal in the 2005 season. The schedule had been made up that Montreal was on the schedule for 2005. And then that on September the 28th, there was rumblings on the radio. Somebody spread the rumor that the Expos were going to be going to Washington, and the announcement would be made the next day on September 29th, the last home game of the Expos.
How did you take that? I mean, you had covered this team for so many years, and then you find out kind of, I want to say abruptly, I guess, like you said, they were 2005 they were going to play there, and then you find out they're going to Washington.
The fan support, I think, has to have a lot to do with that. Uh, Beginning in the 80s, part of the early 90s, after the strike in 95 to 2004. I think it was a combination of the fans not showing any support, but also the fans showing or telling Major League Baseball that we're not happy with Major League Baseball operating the team in the last 3 years of the franchise. It was really unfortunate, but my take is that overall, for many, many years, that the fan support really wasn't that consistent.
Yeah, it seems
That's
like that was kind of the driving factor, that, and obviously that plays into revenue and all that kind of stuff. But when you talk to players now, for either for this book or your previous books, how do they look back on their time in Montreal?
Yeah, the interesting question. A lot of them say they like playing in Montreal. Like Brian Snyder, he thinks that baseball will come back someday. He was the main catcher for the last 2 or 3 years, and a lot of them they said that they really enjoyed playing in Montreal. The fan support and the city of Montreal, the bar scene, and all this kind of stuff. And it was like a cosmopolitan city. The architecture, it reminded some of the players that it was like Europe, old Montreal, and so on. Generally speaking, a lot of the players did like playing in Montreal.
What was the fans' reaction when the team was moving? Obviously, you said the attendance was dropping, but what kind of was their reaction? I'm sure there was plenty of, and there are still plenty of diehard Expos fans. What was that like for that fan base?
Yeah, when it became apparent on September the 29th, 2004, that the Expos were leaving for Washington for 2005, that really upset the fan base. And going into the last game, there was only 10,000 season tickets sold. But when the fans found out that that was the last home game, boy, did they ever buy up the tickets. So that day they sold about 23,000, walk-up tickets, or maybe online calling in for tickets. So that showed that there was a fairly good fan base of people who really loved the Expos. They didn't necessarily uh, buy a lot of tickets to go to a lot of games, but that was their souvenir of the Expos leaving. They wanted to be at the last game. They wanted to go and pick up some souvenirs, some uniform tops, or whatever. So it was quite a jolt. And I was told Claude Delorme, who's the vice president of business affairs, told me for this book that the guys who what's their name? They sell tickets at higher prices. What do you call those guys?
Like a
The
scalper?
scalpers.
Yeah.
The scalpers were coming in on the last game, and they were crying because it was the last game. They were upset that the Expos were leaving too. Not just the fans, but the scalpers, meaning the scalpers would no longer have any Expos game to go to get higher prices. So it really jolted a lot of people in the Montreal community, including the people who the employees. That was a really sad day, September 29th, when the players decided to go into the Expos office and say goodbye. And there's a lot of tears shed because a lot of those employees had been there for years and years and years, and all of a sudden they don't have a job anymore. So the players were crying, the employees were crying. That was really a sad day, September 29th, 2004.
Building on that a little bit, can you speak maybe on the impact that you saw when the Expos left afterwards on baseball in Quebec? Maybe not just in Quebec, Eastern Canada in general. How, that changed maybe how many kids were playing baseball, sort of the grassroots aspect. We see here in Ontario, I live in southwestern Ontario, the impact the Jays have on, growing the game here. Maybe the other way, when the Expos left, can you speak a little bit just to how that impacted baseball in Quebec?
Yeah, my understanding that in recent years since the Expos left, that soccer has kind of taken over the landscape in kids soccer in Montreal and Quebec. And now, see, from 2004 to 2012, there was no mention of the Expos in Montreal. Fans had just pretty well given up on it. But in 2012, uh, Warren Cromartie, the former Expo, around the time that Gary Carter died, um, came to Montreal for a visit or something and discovered that there's no sign of the Expos, no souvenirs, no posters, nothing. So what he did, he organized a reunion of the 81 Expos in 2012, and then another reunion of the 94 Expos in 2014. So Cromartie was the one who started beating the drums about this fever that has been going on for 12 years. Uh, the Blue Jays started playing exhibition games in Montreal, and it really started rejuvenating fan interest and showing Major League Baseball that this city of Montreal could handle another team, an expansion team or a relocated team. But then what happened in January of 2022, Major League Baseball turned down Montreal's bid to have play half the Tampa Bay home games in Montreal beginning in 2027. It was a real farce. It's kind of an idea. It didn't make any sense anyway. But Stephen Bronfman, Charles' son, was the instigator. He really loved this idea of having 40 home games played in Montreal as part of whereby Tampa Bay would still own the team. And but that was Montreal's kind of way to get into getting another major league team, was those 41 home games. But now, the last 2.5 years since Stephen Bronfman has had no interest in a full-time team of 162 games. So he said recently, I wrote 18 months ago that his group did not have any interest in a full-time team of 162 games. It was just too much. 81 home games,
Yeah,
no, not interested in that. So the last couple of years, that fever that had been going on for many years has kind of just diminished quite a bit.
yeah, and it's interesting because Quebec is such a strong baseball province. So many good players coming there playing college baseball, big leagues. Edward Julian is one that stands out from the last couple of years. And you mentioned not to mention that the Nationals won the World Series in 2019, and I couldn't help but think that it's the old Expos. I don't know if anybody else did that, but I know it's 15 years later, but it crossed my mind. And you mentioned a lot of the former players thinking that baseball could come back to Montreal. There's been a lot of talk of expansion. You just went over a little bit of it. Do you think that is a realistic possibility to ever happen?
I think right now it's bleak because there's no group in Montreal interested in taking over the passion that Stephen Bronfman's group had. So Stephen Bronfman says he could be a minority shareholder, but he will not be the major force in any expansion team or relocated team. It's going to cost about $3 billion Canadian for an expansion team, and they don't have a downtown stadium. They have to get a group, or maybe get the city of Montreal, the province of Quebec, to build a downtown stadium. There's not a lot of interest from the city of Montreal in putting together a new stadium. And then, so I think it's possible that there could be foreign investors that might want to do this, but I don't know. It looks pretty bleak right now. But the thing is that Rob Manfred, the commissioner, has been saying there won't be an expansion until 2029. So you never know what's going to happen.
Yeah, fingers crossed, I guess, at least for us up here in Canada. Didn't they just want to put a new roof on the Olympic Stadium? Did I not see that not too long ago?
Yeah, they want to fix the ring around the top of the stadium and fix the roof, which kind of infuriated a lot of fans who were saying, "Well, why don't you build a new stadium instead of fixing up the Olympic Stadium?" So
Yeah,
what is going to happen is that it's not going to be available for baseball, any Blue Jay exhibition games for the next few years. And what they've done too, Matt, is that they've turned the Olympic Stadium mostly into a soccer football configuration. They say that they could possibly change it back into baseball, but so even the Olympic Stadium as a temporary home down the road is may not be a possibility.
yeah. Well, the longer we talk about this, the more far-fetched it kind of seems in my mind, which is upsetting because there's so much talk recently about expansion, but yeah, who knows? 2029 is a long time from now, but Danny, we really appreciate you coming on to the show and talking a little bit about your book and giving us some Expos history for our listeners. So thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for so much, guys, for having me on. It's been a pleasure.
Well, I miss the Expos even more than I did before that conversation, Jackson.
Really, just such a pleasure to hear from Danny, like the history and the all the details he was able to provide. And man, I'm really looking forward to reading that book now, Matt.
Yeah, Explosion again. Make sure you go pick it up. He's got 9 or 10 books on the Expos, and as you heard today, a wealth of knowledge and storytelling. Such a good storyteller, Jackson. That's the one thing I really picked up on. These beat writers from back in those days really know how to tell a story.
Well, and Bob would know it best, right? Like it's just great storytelling. It's what, journalism and covering a team really is all about, right? And such a treat to hear from Danny, who knows so much about the Expos, right? Such an authority on the team and the history. And, that's professional, man. He knew the details, he knew the ins and outs. There were things that he was able to just reporting on, talking about the book, right? Reaching out to people, reaching out to the manager's daughter, things like that he's really willing to go the extra distance, and I think means so much in today's day and age where that's not always the case. It's a breath of fresh air to see such a pro like Danny. But he was talking about that '94 season, right? God, how heartbreaking that must have been for Expos fans, man. I mean, obviously wasn't around back then, but man, oh man, like what that must have been like, the pain to lose, and then 10 years later to lose the team after all that. Ugh, wow.
Yeah, and he even talks about how kind of the end was the last 20 years or so of the franchise was really, with payroll and revenue. And then that 94 season happens. That could have been the big boom. Who knows if that season finishes, are the Expos gone in 2004? Who knows? I mean, maybe that kind of rejuvenates the fan base and the team takes off from that point. So that 1994 strike had a huge impact on baseball broadly, but obviously had a huge played a huge role with the Expos.
And you see it today, though, Matt. Some of these teams, like Oakland, with their payrolls and their lack of investment in the team. Dare I say the Marlins? The Rays are good, yeah, but like some of these teams who, the Pirates, just don't invest in their club. And I think about Expos fans, and I think, man, like how there's some markets around North America who would probably appreciate a lot more of a better product, and I think maybe deserve a better product, including those markets like Oakland and Miami and Pittsburgh, absolutely. But you talk about the low payroll and how, there weren't enough fans going, so we're gonna move a team. Well, boy, I don't see many fans out there in Oakland right now. And when they move to Vegas, they might, but that's a lot of money too. I don't see many fans in Miami right now. You know what I mean? Like that. I think a lot of Montreal fans, Expos fans from back in the day, Canadian baseball fans would look around at some of those southern markets and think, it's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, and then you get to 2004, and he's talking about the players and the staff. He mentions the staff, really goes into detail about how heartbreaking that day was for the Montreal Expos, for everyone involved, including the fans. But yeah, who knows? Like I said with 1994, if that goes differently, you look at the markets now, like you said, it certainly is interesting, and I wanted to touch on expansion with them. Unfortunately, that doesn't sound overly promising. So I guess we'll have to see if Manfred did mention 2029 as an expansion potential. A lot can happen in 5 years. It was great to talk some Expos with someone that knows the team. I say this a lot, knows them better than anyone, but he really does as an Expos historian, covering the team as a beat writer. So many books. It was just a pleasure to have Danny on today. Until next time, make sure to follow the Canadian Baseball Network on Twitter and subscribe for just $2 a month. Take care.
Thank you for listening. Be sure to check out Canadian Baseball Network for extensive and comprehensive coverage of the latest in Canadian baseball. And The Baseball Zone, Canada's leading instructional baseball academy and training home to thousands of MLB pro, college, and youth baseball players.